Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey, what's up, guys? It's guys and girls. It's Scott Groves, or no, people of all ages. That's what we're supposed to say now, right? That's what Disneyland says.
Dreamers
Dreamers of all ages. Scott Groves here, the On the Edge podcast. We're speaking with a brand new friend, Sam Lacrosse, who I don't know. I haven't read his book. I haven't read his blog, which ironically is called don'treadthisblog.com. So I feel pretty good about the fact that I haven't read it. But when good people make good introductions, I just want to talk to them and get to know more about them. And the funny thing is, other than maybe one of our other young interviews, several podcasts back, my buddy Jesus, Sam is like a legit millennial, 24 years old, coming to you in 2022. So he grew up right around the turn of the millennium. He wrote a book called Value Economics, which I want to dig into and learn more about. Obviously, if you're watching this, you can see behind him, he has a Cleveland Browns flag. And there would be no reason whatsoever to be a Cleveland Browns fan other than being from Cleveland. So I know you live in Austin right now, Sam, but I'm guessing you're from Cleveland somewhere.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you for having me, by the way, Scott. I really appreciate being on and, the ability to kind of talk to your audience here. But yeah, so just a guy that grew up, like LeBron James, only, much more unathletic. Just a guy from Cleveland, Ohio, grew up about 20 minutes outside the city in a small little working to upper class suburb called Avon, and then, grew up there for the first 18 years of my life, and then went to school in Columbus, dipped out to Boston for a year. And then now I've been in Austin, Texas since May of 2021, excuse me.
Nice. And what took you to Austin other than the fact that all the cool kids live in Austin now?
Well, it was that. And so it's funny because I have a day job. I work in technology sales. And so there are a lot of hotspots for that around the country. And so I had this kind of idealistic version of Texas. I like to think about it like when a lot of immigrants were coming here in the early 19th century from other countries, and they viewed America as kind of this like idealistic kind of thing that they would want to go to. I think that was honestly what Texas was for me. I kind of had this weird, bizarre fascination about living somewhere in Texas where, I could just be myself and buy a bunch of land and wouldn't have to like talk to anybody or anything like that. That was all honestly kind of like cool for me. So I wanted to live in Texas since I was probably in high school. And so when I got the opportunity to move out to Boston for my first job, my entry level, and I ended up being lucky enough to get a promotion out in Austin. Living in Austin, Texas has been a huge blessing. I've met a lot of great people out here, and it's been very, very good to me. It's a little high, and when you go out and buy food and stuff like that, especially with the market situation right now. But it's been overall very, very positive change for my life, and I'm very happy. So big blessing.
That's awesome, man. In my mind, Austin, Texas is what a lot of America could be, in the sense that like I'm there's this old joke that, what is it? It's like I'm a communist at my dinner table, I'm a socialist in my neighborhood, and I'm a libertarian or a Republican, depending on how you want to finish the story when it comes to the federal government. And I like the idea of a smaller community, city, town, suburb, or whatever, that leans a little bit more liberal, has some culture, has some arts, is more accepting, who gives a shit who sleeps with who or who smokes what. But then on a grander stage, at like the state level, if I want to, open a business or, I don't know, put my own water tank on my own property or whatever, I want the larger governing body to be leaning more right and more hands off and less masks and less mandates. And so I'm also fascinated by Austin of like, cool, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, where you get some culture, you get some more liberal take on things. But then when the things that really matter, like how I'm going to raise my kids and how I'm going to run my business and how I'm going to pay taxes, that's more conservative. So that also appeals to me in a kind of idealized way.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I don't know who eventually told me this, but I think it was one of my buddies out in Boston when I was working out there. Apparently, Austin is the most liberal city in America, but we're also deep in a very, very red state. Right. So to your point, it's kind of like almost an oasis for a lot of people who want to kind of, come here to experience, because there is great art and great food and great music and great people and a bunch of people from very, very, it's almost like, it's going back to the America point. Like it's truly a melting pot of like everybody you could want to find out here. It is truly a bizarre, wild type of place. And so there is something for everybody here. And I think that's why kind of everyone can at least coexist with one another. It's seemingly better than a lot of other places because it's not so, I would say, entrenched in one ideology versus another. It's a lot of things mixing together and kind of moving around and stuff, which is cool.
Yeah, I would say it's ironic because the two people I know that are on extreme polar opposites, like a friend of mine who's so conservative he's kind of got off the deep end, prepper, thinks everything's a conspiracy. And a friend of mine who thinks the world is going to provide and all you need is the right chakra crystals and money will flow to you. And like California liberals are not nearly progressive enough for her. She lives in Austin and he lives in Austin. And I'm like, how can this city sustain both points of view? But that's supposed to be the beauty of America.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of like, I guess you can phrase it as a place where, QAnon and the Marxists all go to frolic in the flowers because they're all the same type of crazy at the end of the day. So it's all about, people who think that, Hillary Clinton's in the basement with pizza with a bunch of kids. And then on the opposite side, it's probably, I don't even know what the opposite side, but I don't know. It's Barry Point's all a bunch of crazy people all living in one part. And we kind of, the majority of people I think are just like, okay, we'll let them be. We'll let them kind of stew in their own, mental, soup or whatever. And then the rest of us will kind of just stay here and be normal people and treat people with respect. Like I remember, I don't know, have you ever been to Austin before?
Yeah, I've been.
Yeah, so Austin is, you go to Terry Black's or some, massive barbecue joint down here. And I remember going down here with a friend who eventually moved down here and his dad, and, they were kind of touring and looking at an apartment. He eventually moved into my apartment complex. And so he came down here to visit me and everything. And it was just kind of like, his dad was just kind of blown away. He's like, dude, there's everybody here. It's like, there's white people, there's black people, there's Latino people, there's gay people, trans people. It was just like a bunch of different people that were just going and enjoying really fire brisket. And then that was kind of a weird thing where he's like, wow, like this is kind of, very, very open space for a lot of people. And I'm like, yeah. So it's cool.
Is Terry's the one that's like indoor, outdoor, that has a little outdoor stage that they do bands all the time? Yeah.
So I don't know if there's a stage out there, but it's got the big smokers in the back. It's right by the river. There's a big park outside the yeah. So it's that one. I don't know if that's the one you're talking about.
So I'm pretty sure I went there. I've been to Austin maybe 4 or 5 times to visit friends.
I think you're thinking about Stubbs. Stubbs is the one where Rogan and Chappelle did stand up at. So I think that's what.
Yeah. Okay. That one.
Yep.
We went there to see a band when we were there we just happened to be in town at the same time as South by Southwest, staying at some friend's house. And we went there. And exactly to your point, there was a really cool, like a wannabe Lumineers kind of, folksy rock band playing. They were very good. And in the audience, just eating it up, was one, and it was like 150 degrees out. One cowboy with like a cowboy hat, long sleeve shirt, jeans, open carry, Magnum 44, revolver or something like that on his hip, sitting right next to a girl with armpit hair down to her waist and like dirty bare feet. And they were both just like loving it up and enjoying the barbecue and loving the music. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is what the media wants us to believe about how much people hate each other. Like those two people are literally supposed to try to shoot each other if you watch any of the mainstream media.
Right.
And they were just at a barbecue joint together, loving it up, like enjoying the same music. We're so much more alike than we are different, but you just got to stay away from the news, which is crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting to think about that kind of a concept in a lot of ways because, one, you wonder why they push that in the first place. And obviously it's because of money or power, or, influence or whatever have you. But, it's if you do just kind of shut it off and you go out and you actually experience what people are like and you see actual things about what people think. It's like you see actual people, you talk with real people, not just people like, we live in such a weird hybrid environment with work and everything now. You kind of see only people digitally, but you go inside and you see that people are really, really friendly. And so, for example, I was at this work event yesterday where we went on a boat around Lake Austin, did everything else. And like I said, it was just kind of like I work for a tech company, but it's still kind of, you have everyone from a lot of different places. Like I know people, in my office that are from California, that are from a town like literally like 5 minutes away from my house, that are from Florida, that are from Texas, that are from all over the place. And yet we were able to remarkably go on a boat and not throw each other overboard, keel haul one another, sink the boat, do all this other kind of shit that people are so weird about these days. And it's just not real. It's all a mirage. It literally is. It's all fake. And so if people can realize that, they'll have a lot better time existing nowadays, frankly.
I agree. So tell me about value economics. You said something that spurred on some initial thought for you and kind of framing the book, or at least the thought process and the college education and the blog post that led to the book. You said, you were talking to your mom and she's like, well, you millennials don't believe in anything, which my retort to that would be like, well, good job, Mom, not instilling any confidence and believing anything. Maybe you guys should have got to church or something, or whatever she wants you to believe in.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that conversation, and then how does that lead into writing a book called Value Economics, and what does that even mean?
Yeah. So, a lot of people are commenting around, I'm actually Gen Z. So millennials, I think I'm a very old Gen Z and a very young, or like I'm not quite a young millennial. I'm a very, very old Gen Z. So I'm like an elder statesman for like people in my age. And so I think there was this quote by Neil Ferguson, who's this famous historian. I don't know if you know who he is.
Yeah.
And he basically said, the data is in that, Gen Z is pretty messed up. Like that was literally the words that he used for all these people. And it's very true. And so I was talking with my mom about we were having a conversation, I think mostly centered around belief in something or everything else. And she said exactly what you said, like, you guys really don't believe in anything. And so I kind of took that, kind of hard. I was like, well, I think it's kind of harsh or whatever. And so,
right.
But I thought about it, and, you always want to take something like that, that's a pretty bold statement like that, and really, in my opinion, at least analyze if it does have merit. And so I thought it did, although I didn't think it was totally, accurate in a lot of ways. But I went and I analyzed it. I started thinking about it and, tossing all these weird thoughts around my head like I usually do. And so I ended up just kind of thinking about a relationship between the act of valuing something and the act of sacrificing to get that something. And so my thesis was, and I think this is pretty universal across no matter how you think about things, it's just that the more you value something, the more you will ultimately sacrifice to get that something. And the less you value that something, the less you will sacrifice to get that something. And so, again, I was just kind of like, cool, whatever. And so I kind of put it in the back part of my brain and just moved on with my life. And then about 6-ish months later, or 5-ish months later, it was October of 2019, right before the pandemic hit. I was in my senior year of college, and I was basically having pretty strong senioritis, thinking I was going to ride into the sunset until COVID, wrecked my sunset. And then I was kind of in my economics class, and, you had to take an advanced economics class to graduate. And so I was just kind of chilling in the back with my buddies and seeing the professor, who was a really nice guy, go through some simple, basic supply and demand curves. And so I had kind of a click moment where I was like, okay, this is a relationship between two things. What I was talking about was a relationship between two things. I knew I wanted to start a blog. I had already bought the web address, the intellectual property, kind of everything be set up and everything. I just had to really spin up and design it and all that kind of shit. So I was thinking about those two type of things. And so I was like, okay, this would be a good first blog post. Why don't I try to at least take my original idea and model it to see if it would work in a setting where I can have a defined model with constraints and variables and everything inside of it to test and see if it's right. So I did it. And besides I have a blog post. That was my first post I made as a wannabe internet blogger, as I call myself in my book. And so I, basically wrote the post, and it went over well, and I thought it made sense. And so the next month I said, okay, why don't I do and it was called Value Economics Chapter 1, the Value Sacrifice Trade-off, which turned out to be Chapter 4 in my book, Value Economics Study of Identity. And so the next month I said, okay, let's try this again. Let's take another economic model and apply it to something else in life. And I thought that worked pretty well. And so then Chapter 2 became Chapter 3, and then Chapter 4 and 5, 6, 7. And I think I stopped around 7, and I kind of analyzed my quote unquote body of work. And I said, I might have a trend here, because I do have most of a book written if I want to write a book. And I always wanted to write a book. I love to read. I love to write. I love to do all these things. I wrote competitively as a kid. I read almost a book a week. And so I was like, this could work out pretty well. And I remember talking about the idea with my parents, and my parents, to their credit, were just like, go for it. That would be awesome. And so in October of 2020, I fully committed to writing a book, spent the next year kind of finalizing and rewriting everything and fine-tuning all my points, stringing the line of thought together. And that line of thought was about the subject that my mom talked about earlier, was about identity and really who we are and everything else like that. And identity is a pretty hot topic now, as you were talking about a little bit earlier, because people are kind of saying, I identify as this is my identity, this is who I am. And I think a lot of the stuff has merit. And I think a lot of the stuff really does kind of go into a deeper level of what we're doing. But I don't think it's enough to justify each individual's person's worth. Because if I were to ask you just a general question, what is a white person? What is a black person? What is a Latino? What is a transgender man? What is this? What is that? What is this person? You could say probably the very scientific answer, which is the amount of melanin in their skin, a person who has a gender change surgery, whatever that could be. But at the end of the day, you'll end up stereotyping that person in some way if you just keep it and limit it there. You have to go deeper than that. And the way I was brought up, especially by my father, but my mother really too, my dad just banged the table quite literally every night about this. He mentioned values and everything that pertained to values. You always got to go back to your values, go back to your values, go back to your values. So that was an interesting question, because it's one of those things where, if I told you like what a circle was, and then I asked you to define a circle, I don't know if a lot of people could really define an answer off the top of their head because we're so used to seeing circles. And I was so used to hearing the word values from my father. And so that led me to another interesting question. Okay, what is a value? What at foundational level is this? And so my thesis was that in order to correctly construct your identity and have the best chance of living the best life that you can, you have to distill it down to your individual values and what metaphysically makes you up as a person at what you believe as an individual. And then after that, you could really go through your life and have a productive way about doing that. And so the rest of the book was framing about, okay, one, how to define individual values, how to make individual values and create systems out of those. And two, what are some principles that are at least sourced from economic theory that you can apply and use to kind of chart your course throughout your life? And so that's what ended up turning out to be all 10 chapters plus an introduction, closing of the book. And it went live on, and so basically I took that and I shopped it to a publisher that actually published David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me, and Tiffany Haddish's book, The Last Black Unicorn, and a couple of other very, very famous people that really went through there. A lot of Bitcoin influencers have had their book published through them. And I pitched it to their head of author talent, Miles Rote, and he loved it. And he offered me a deal on the spot. And then about 7 months later, it came out on June 28th of 2022 on all platforms, in ebook, hardcover, and paperback. And here we are, and it's been going pretty well so far. And, obviously have my criticisms and have everything else, but that's kind of how it came to be.
Man, that's awesome. There's so much to unpack there. So I want to talk a little bit about the value sacrifice, if we can think of it like a graph in comparison to supply and demand. So do you parse out, or have you spent a lot of time thinking, if this is my value, where's my sacrifice, right? And we could probably go everywhere from like, I value time, so I'm willing to use an ATM instead of a bank teller because I value spending 5 minutes. But that doesn't really cost me anything. It costs me maybe one pleasant human sacrifice, all the way up to there's certain values that many people would die for. So it's kind of an interesting continuum, just like a supply chain, or sorry, a supply and demand graph. What has your kind of thoughts or research or writing the book? What does that led you to believe about kind of this continuum of like value versus sacrifice?
So that's a great question. And so the thing is, I know how to use Google Docs to create a very, very simplistic draft. And I'm proud to say that my Google Doc draft did make it inside of the book. So I didn't have to use any fancy tools or anything like that. But so I basically said that I thought a lot about this actually. And my basic assumption was that on the big stuff and on the little stuff, it's almost a linear equation. Like it's almost 1-to-1. It's like one, and you can't really measure like what is 1 unit of sacrifice, what is 1 unit of value. That's up to the individual person. That's covered in the earlier parts of the book. And so let's just say for the time one is actually a great example, because there is an example that I say in my book about a dad who works a lot. Like, I mean, my dad was one of those dads, so I kind of, sourced a lot from him. My dad worked a ton when I was growing. He still works a ton now. He was like basically a 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. guy, 6 days a week and all that kind of stuff. So he worked really, really hard. My sister has autism. She needed a lot of other supplementary help growing up. So, I mean, he had to basically, she was like, Sam, I got a daughter with autism. I got to work. My mom was basically, she wasn't a stay-at-home mom. She was actually a 2-time entrepreneur, went on to get her doctorate degree with 3 teenage children. I don't really understand how she did that, but she's a very, very impressive person. And so, but my dad, on the other hand, when he went down to Florida, they moved down to Florida for about a year. He really, really had to crank it up because he made it to a C-suite, basically executive level position. He really had to put in a lot of hours. And so he really, really valued the utility of his job in order to being able to provide for his family, the monetary reward that came from that. But on the flip side of that, I remember literally telling him once, like, Dad, you're gonna kill yourself if you keep working. Like, you realize that, right? It's like you are going to, like, he looked like shit, he ate like shit, he never worked out, he never saw people, he wasn't home he was home much less than he was. I remember one time he went on a trip that was at least probably 3 or 4 weeks long. Like, he was in like China or in India for like 3 or 4 weeks. And that's a long time to be away from your wife. And this is when I was out of the house. I was in college by this point. But I remember, talking to my mom, and, she was very, very upset about that and all that kind of stuff, understandably, because that's her best friend. That's her husband. That's kind of, her life partner. And I remember that, it was just such a draw and a drag on the rest of my family that it got to a point where my dad was like, you're right. I need to go back and I need to reset. And thankfully he's got a much better, I would say, balance with that now. But it's all about it's all basically a linear correlation, in my opinion. If you pick one thing versus the other, you lean really hard into that, the pendulum does swing back, and the opposite, whatever that is, suffers very, very hardly. It suffers a lot. And no matter really what that is, I remember I would say, and this is what I get into chapter 6 in my book called diminishing returns of value. There's a diminishing returns on that after a while because you start to plateau. And I remember I was in my junior year of college, and I was a finance major in college, actually. So this is where my mediocre knowledge of economics comes in. And so I remember I was in basically, this was kind of the big boy internship year where I had to, clout chase in front of my business school teammates to basically say that, or my classmates rather, to say that I was going to like do something with my life and work for like a credible Fortune 500 company or an institution or whatever. And so I remember I was just so focused on getting my internship, and I had a lot of hard quantitative classes. This was when I really started hitting my finance curriculum hard. And so I remember I went for 9 months, 5 a.m. to midnight, every night for 9 months. And I remember finally just kind of getting to a point in my final exams at the end of the year where I could finally relax. I had a lot of volunteering events that I did. I volunteer. I'm an ambassador for several charities. I do all that kind of stuff. And I remember all of that was over. All of my stress was gone. And so I got invited or nominated actually by my president of my charity to go up to a place called Toledo, Ohio, in northwestern Ohio, where my charity is based out of. And so we went up there and I networked with a lot of people, and the president of the charity Rally Cap Sports, who actually was an endorser on the back of my book, Paul Hooker, which is really cool. And so he's a friend of mine. He's a phenomenal person. And so he went up to speak and talk to us and meet us and everything. And so I remember, I didn't drink. I remember they offered me to kind of like, hey, you want a beer? Like if you're 21, my birthday was in October. So I was, this was April 12th of 2019. So I was kind of like, hey, like I'm good, whatever. I got to drive back tonight. It was only like 9 o'clock at night. So I was just kind of an hour and a half drive from Toledo to Columbus, where I went to school. And so I left at like 9 o'clock. And so started going down I-85 down back to Columbus. I, plugged my iPhone on shuffle and just kind of wanted to go have a nice ride out, nice night outside, whatever. And so I remember I woke up 20 minutes later to someone tapping on my window. And I was like, that's weird, because I don't remember stopping. And so I begin to come to, and my eyes are kind of, blurring and, shaking out and blinking open, whatever. And my hood's bent up, and I see some smoke going out of my engine. And I look, and my door cracks open, and a guy in a paramedic's uniform comes up to me, and I'm still in my car. And I then see 2 guys out in the front left of my Jeep. I was in a Jeep Wrangler with a bodyboard, and I was a lifeguard.
With a body bag?
With a body board. So like, when you're at, I did not die. Don't worry. I didn't kill anybody.
Okay, good.
And so no. So when you go to like a public pool and they have the body board, right?
Yeah. To strap you on. In case
like if someone hurts their back or something.
Right,
yeah.
Gotcha.
So I was like, again, like that's kind of weird. And so I asked, and the paramedic, who turned out to be like the coolest guy ever, he kind of tapped my window and was like, hey man, you doing okay? I'm like, yeah. Like, I mean, like what's going on? He's like, yeah, well, we think you had a seizure while driving down the highway, and you hit a bunch of stuff, so we need to get you out of the car. And I was like, I did what? And so he's like, yeah, you had a seizure, you rear-ended somebody, you basically totaled your car, we need to get you to the hospital. And so what happened was I was on cruise control at 70 miles an hour driving in the left lane, and I started seizing, like the whole thing, arms flailing above my head, all the other shit. And so I eventually veered off the side of the road, scraped against the cement median. The lady in front of me saw me having a seizure from her rearview mirror, so she pulled off the road to dial 911, but I was still on cruise control. So I slammed into the back of her car at 70 miles an hour, spun head on back into oncoming traffic, got hit head on again by a station wagon, got thrown back into the median, and then I just kind of sat there. And so there's this big wreckage scene on the thing. They kind of bodyboard me up. They put me through all this other kind of stuff. And so I called my parents. I'm like, I'm in the hospital, everything else. And so they ran tests on me. I ran 2 CAT scans, 2 MRIs, 2 EKGs, everything like that. And they found nothing wrong with me. And no psychological, I had no history of seizures, no history of epilepsy, nothing, I wasn't hydrated. I obviously was well fed. I just went to a Buffalo Wild Wings and ate wings for like 3 hours. And I wasn't tired because I wasn't stressed. And so the only conclusion that I can come to was that all of that shit that I did for the prior 9 months had something to do with that. I don't know if, like, I should have died in that car crash. If I was not in a Jeep, I should have died. Yeah. And I would have gotten flung through my windshield, neck broken, bad shit would have happened.
Yeah.
But it didn't. And so that's the only logical conclusion that I came with. And that was when I said, okay, there comes a point where you can only sacrifice so much before you have to settle for something that is okay. or at least reset to a point where you don't literally kill yourself like I almost did.
Right.
And so that was, I would say, again, long story for a short answer, but that was kind of the limits and the kind of, I would say, excess that I had in that all kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So and by the way, that makes totally sense that if you're at like the pinnacle of a big project, you know, this 9-month push where you're every day, 5 a.m. till midnight, just like the release of endorphins, your body was probably exhausted. It probably forced you to have a seizure just to slow down and take a nap. I mean, how crazy. So when we talk about value economics, I'm interested. Are we talking about my core values and how I see myself and the things that I claim to be important to me? Or are we talking more about, hey, what's the dollar trade-off, or what's the things that I'm willing to pay for, invest in, whether that's time or money, in order to, I don't want to use the word virtue signal because that has like a negative connotation right now, but basically to expose my value to people?
So I would say it's a little bit of both. It's definitely more towards your core personal values. Your life generally reflects, and that includes the amount of money you make, I think, kind of what your personal value system is. Like if you, there's a difference between someone who becomes a nurse versus someone who starts a business. You know, you have different motivations and perception of what you see about monetary wealth, about money, about income streams, about revenue, all that kinds of stuff. So this is more focused on your innermost core values and everything that kind of goes on with it and all that kind of stuff. But I think it can be both if you want it to be both. And I think there are people that really can kind of see what's going on there. But I think that there are a lot of things that, you know, it's mostly about your core values and who you are as an individual, because I truly think that's what your identity is made of. And that will ultimately reflect what you reap out of your life.
I love it. You know, I'm going to speak way out of way out of my knowledge base. And some of this is just stuff that I'm parroting or repeating from podcasts. And sorry, see, this is proof that we actually do this in my garage because the sun's coming right through the garage and we're having to.
No, I love it. Who's the guy behind you?
That's our audio tech, Chris. No.
What's up, Chris?
No, we're having to do some emergency lighting stuff, and now we're gonna get some weird disease from the glue that we're spraying all over, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. Again, I'm not formally educated. I didn't go to college, but a lot of this is from either books that I've read or podcasts that I've listened to or YouTube videos that I've watched. And I think there's an interesting, I guess I would call it postmodern theory or thought process that there really is no value. It's all about like, there's no value in the sense that there's a right or wrong societally. It's about, you know, it's about my experience, or, you know, some people call it my lived experience, or whatever the case may be, where it's like, no, there is no shared value. There is no like American value. There is no conservative value or liberal value or whatever the case may be. There's just whoever you are. And basically claiming that there is effectively no right or wrong because there can be no value judgment. And I'm like, well, I'm not particularly smart, but doesn't saying that there is no value, isn't that intrinsically a value statement? Like if you're saying there can be no value, that in and of itself is saying that there is a value or placing value on it. So I'm just wondering, as you've kind of gone through this journey and done a lot of reading and research, obviously, does Austin, Texas have core values, or do, you know, people that are in Boy Scouts together have core values, or should, maybe not, maybe one question is do and one question is should, you know, do Americans have core values anymore? Because like we were talking earlier, things seem much more divisive than they need to be. So are there values, right? Because when I think about leaving here, it's like, well, I'm not going to go get drunk at the dinner I have scheduled tonight and drive home drunk and potentially kill somebody. What prevents me from doing that is not that it's illegal. What prevents me from doing that is I have a value for human life. I have a value for my own safety. I have a value for the people in my community. And when people are like, well, no, there really is no values. There's no right or wrong. It's just whatever your experience is. I'm like, no, that sounds like a path to complete societal breakdown. So I'm just wondering, maybe this is way out of the scope of anything you looked at for your book, but I'm just wondering, since we're talking about values, does anything I just said either land with you or something you've thought about or something you address in the book?
Yeah, I would say it's all three. And I would like to just kind of touch on the first thing you made, because it's a very important point, because I think we have a lot of people in our society right now, and no matter what they think about the world or political systems or anything, where they're just saying like, oh, I'm accepting, I'm tolerant of everybody. I accept everybody. And it's like, well, okay, well, what do you think about white supremacists? Like, do you accept them? Like, or like, do you accept people that like, how about people that are generally intolerant towards other people? And they're like, well, they don't count. I'm like, well, yes, they do. You just said that you accept everybody. So you either clearly don't and you're lying, or you don't, or you're ignorant and you don't really know that you're lying. So to that point about everyone, the no values comment, that's complete nonsense. And I think that everybody has, and even I would say, to make a religious resemblance to this, I'm a Christian. So I would say that, people who are atheists, they kind of say that, they don't really believe in a higher power. They don't believe in everything else. And excuse me, I also think that's not true, because you have something you revolve your center of the universe around, whether that is money, or that's a spouse, or, lust for women, or something like that.
Or CrossFit or being a vegan. Cause people,
people
proselytize to me more about going to CrossFit than the Christians that I know about reading the Bible. So
yeah, right. I was just saying, like, veganism, like we mentioned QAnon earlier, like all these other kind of weird types of people that do all these weird type of things. And so there is no vacuum of values, because everyone, whether they want to admit it or not, has values, just like they have hierarchical structures of values, whether that be religious or not religious, or whatever they want to call it. And so I think that there are, to the second point, such thing as group values, but they have to be based on individual constraints. They have to be based on individual constraints. So I think, honestly, religion is the greatest example for this. Like, I have a friend who I just saw, I was in Columbus for my book launch about a month ago when it came out. And so I have a friend who is a very, very devout Muslim. His parents are immigrants from Palestine. And so he goes back to see them every summer and spend a couple of weeks with them. And so he and I agree on a lot of things. When we are he was actually on my podcast, I listened to this podcast, and we were talking about, literally the subject of the interview was that we think differently on everything politically, almost everything else, but we can understand each other, and we're very good friends. We have a great time. We hang out with one another, even though, he can't drink alcohol because of his religion. I can drink alcohol because of my religion. I can do all this, sort of stuff. He has limitations. I have limitations. He doesn't have limitations. So we were kind of talking about, like, what is that? And I remember we were talking about, I asked him, sent him over a list of questions for my podcast. And, we were talking kind of, it wasn't a political discussion, but political things were involved. And I asked him, a question about, he asked me questions in return. And so I said, sure, like, I'll go ahead and ask. And so he basically asked me a question about healthcare. And he said that, if someone breaks their arm, like falling off, like if a little kid breaks their arm falling off a tree or something, should they have to pay an arm an arm and a leg, $50,000 to get that arm replaced? And I said, no, of course not. And he's like, okay, so you agree on the basic stuff, right? And I'm just like, yes, of course I do. Like, no parent should have to pay $50,000 to fix their kid's broken arm. Of course not. And so then it's like, okay, it's just about the implementation of all the stuff that we disagree on versus everything else. And I'm like, yes. And so, okay, that's good. So it's a way of organizing yourself based on what you think is really a value to you. So I think Christians have similar values. That's why Christians have values. Muslims have similar values. They kind of go together. Religious Jews have similar values. They kind of go together. I think companies are this way. Whether you want to work in a small business, a big business, a startup, a corporate setting like I'm in, you value certain things about why you want to work at the company. And I think increasingly you're seeing a lot of a toxic version of this from Gen Z, where they're really being quite militant about this, in my opinion. If they don't really go all the way out there for, what's going on in the world or society, or whatever, they want to basically tear the whole thing down at this point. But it's a way of organizing yourself to interact with fellow humans that share your values. And I think that's very, very important, because if you develop a system of values, but you don't find community within those values, you're going to live a pretty lonely existence. Because one of the things that I talk about in my first chapter that's very, very important, and I kind of issue it as a warning almost, is the polarization aspect of having values. Like, a man who values everything values nothing. And so when you take a stance and when you say you value a certain thing, you are never going to alienate somebody. You're going to alienate somebody, at least one person, with one of your values.
Right.
And so the thing about that is you can either then choose to go the opposite way and find people that do share those values, or you can withdraw from both categories, which I don't think is a very good option. So you're going to make people upset with the way you feel and the way you think, but you have a choice to really go to that other group of other people that will accept you for who you are and will kind of accept you for what you want to be and push you to be better and push you to really kind of lean into those values pretty hard if they really are good values and improve your life. So I would say on the second part, I think that kind of, you said that deconstruction is kind of a Marxist type of narrative around society, around kind of there being no value, there being no group value. I don't think there is merit to both of those statements, quite honestly.
Right. Right. Well, all you have to do is look at history to realize there's zero value. There's a huge negative value to being a Marxist. I mean, it's not
like negative value.
Yeah. Horrible negative value. We're not breaking new ground on that. But it's interesting. I want to share one funny story with you about being a Christian. Is I was born and raised Presbyterian. I was baptized. I went to church camp every summer until I was 18 and left for the Army. I've read most of the Bible. I find myself having arguments in defense of religion frequently, even though I don't consider myself religious. I don't practice a certain faith. Yeah. I think it would be just as ignorant to say I don't believe in God as maybe I would think that it is to say I do believe in God. I don't know. I have a lot of confusion around religion, but religion also doesn't bother me. I have a lot of arguments in defense of religion to people that think they've figured it out because they're anti-religious. And so I was at a big round table, and I won't use any of these people's names because I don't want to embarrass anybody. And we were just coming out of this big mastermind session with a bunch of like big wigs and coaching, and we were all talking about developing our own coaching programs. And, the topics of the week-long training seminar, this was like a coaching event for coaches came up, and I'm like, what's kind of funny, guys, is like, I get it that this is kind of a repackaging, but like, let's just not pretend this isn't Christianity. And they were so offended because these were like a lot of liberals, and they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, daily meditation, kind of like this thing called prayer, start and end your day with times of reflection. And they're like, no, it's not prayer. It's scientifically proven that meditation. I'm like, yeah, but it's basically prayer. And then, we were talking about books like Conscious Leadership and things of that nature. And I'm like, oh, you mean like Take Care of Your Fellow Man, and a bunch of these books that talk about companies that are for good profit companies are the ones that are thriving. I'm like, oh, you mean kind of like tithing? And it's like, I just kept going back to all these, Judeo-Christian beliefs that have now somehow morphed into like this brand new science we have about how to run your life and run your business. And I'm like, dude, that's been in the Bible since about, whatever the council was, 20, was it 212 when they like formalized the books of the Bible. I'm like, it's been around for almost 2,000 years, guys. Like we're not really breaking new ground with meditation changes your brain waves and it makes you a better, more gratuitous, a better person that exhibits more gratitude. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure I read that somewhere when I was like 9. So anyway, I just thought that was funny that like there's a new repackaging of like the value set, which is really just Judeo-Christian values. So I thought that was funny.
That's hilarious, man. I think that's, I think we do. Full disclosure, I mean, I don't think, honestly, except for maybe the book title, none of what I said, I don't think is new. I mean, a lot of people have been saying, a lot smarter than me, have been saying this shit for a while.
Right.
And I think the only way that a lot of people, a lot of ways, and, there are authors that have been honest, very few, but there are some authors that I enjoy that have been honest about this. It's just how you frame them and how you re-say them that's different. Yeah. And so I kind of have a unique style of writing and kind of a way, at least I think I have a unique style of writing, where I kind of just am very open and raw and honest about kind of, my life. And, it's basically like, it turned out to be more memoir-y than I would have initially thought it was going to be, because again, I'm only 24. No one knows who I am, so who's going to care about my life, that whole type of thing.
Right.
But, it turned out, to be almost a sense of where I was basically telling everyone about, my fuck ups and how I quite literally got punched in the face for the first time. And a lot of times after that as a kid and everything like that. And, how I almost died in a seizure, how I almost failed out of college, how I was, addicted to things, how I was a bunch of other stuff. And so, it turned out to just kind of be, I have a rule when I'm writing, because I can tend to, especially when I'm writing about topical things, I can go after people kind of hard, but I always have a personal rule that I will never punch anybody in the mouth as hard and fast as I will punch myself in the mouth. And so I did not want it to be like a sermon from on high from Sam Lacrosse, who no one knows, telling him how much he's better than all of them. Right. I didn't want that at all. I wanted it to be a very, I would say, mutual discussion about how we're all kind of broken as human beings, and we're all kind of just trying to make some sense out of whatever the shit is. Yeah. And then that turned out to be what the book was in a lot of ways. So,
well, here's something interesting, and this is actually making me feel better about a relationship that I didn't end, but that ended. You said something 8 minutes ago or something about how, hey, values are kind of polarizing, and if you pick a value, you are intrinsically going to upset other people who have a contrary value. If I'm a huge bacon eater, Maybe it will offend me that a certain faith doesn't eat pork, right? Like that's just how it is.
Yeah,
Doesn't
yeah,
mean
right,
doesn't mean
sure.
I have to be disrespectful to that person. It doesn't mean I have to cancel them. Doesn't mean I have to hate them. It's just like, oh, we have competing values. Like I venomously disagree with you there. I don't think
Yep.
eating bacon, which is the greatest thing ever created by God, is going to send me to hell because I decided to eat some pork. But I had this conversation with a friend one time about Boy Scouts. And Boy Scouts is now not Boy Scouts, it's the Scouts, and they allow girls in Scouts, and it was a big fucking political hot potato. And I was trying to explain to a girlfriend of mine who I was like, hey, like, you're just out of your zone here because, one, you weren't a Boy Scout. I was a Boy Scout from second grade till the day I left for the Army. My audio technician right now is actually the younger brother of my best friend. We were all Boy Scouts together. The guy who I consider a second father was my Boy Scout leader. And I'm like, this is like an area where I feel like I'm a subject matter expert. And one of the values that I have, one of the core values that I had about thinking about putting my son in Boy Scouts is there were conversations that were had. There were physical altercations that happened. There was mentor moments that happened from father to son and uncles to friends and other fathers to other kids that simply do not happen if there's a female around. Whether that's a female leader or whether that's a girl that wants to be in Scouts with the boys. Like, you know, I went to a co-ed public school, so it's like there was plenty of time to interact with the opposite sex and be in, you know, debate club together and go on field trips together and even overnight trips together. And our wrestling team had girls on the wrestling team. But Boy Scouts was kind of this sacred place where, like, I got man time and I learned so many lessons about how to be a man, how to treat women, how to deal with conflict, right? That just, many of those conversations do not happen if there's a woman around. So I tried to explain to this gal who was a friend of mine and happens to be a pretty left-wing progressive, like, hey, these are my values and we're just never going to agree on this. And not only are we not going to agree on this, because I have a basis of experience, I just think you're wrong. And she said, no, you're just sexist. We're never talking again. And I'm like, okay, well, this kind of leads me to believe that for the most part, when we get into a values discussion or a value debate, there does seem to be one side of the aisle that thinks you're wrong, and that would be generally conservatives, if that's how we're describing them. And then there's one side of the aisle, generally liberals in my mind, or progressives, I would say. I wouldn't even call them liberals anymore. I'd call them progressives, that they don't think you're wrong. They think you're evil and you should be canceled. So it's like I'm thinking about many examples where I can go, hey, you know, we'll call it the right-wing response has been to boycott, to create a different company, you know, to say, I think you're wrong. And for the most part, if I'm generalizing, the left's response when there's a value disagreement is you're evil, you should be canceled, you should not have a place in the public square. And I don't understand, because all it is, like you're saying, all it is it's a disagreement on values. And that's okay. We can have, you and I probably have 90 disagreements on values. And there's none of those that would make me think you're an evil person unless you're like a pedophile. I have a few hard stops where I will agree that somebody is an evil person, but am I making this up? And I would guess, you know, based on what's behind you on the wall, the POW MIA, knowing that you're a Christian, I could probably generalize and guess that you're more farther right or right or conservative or libertarian. So maybe I'm just asking a question I know you're going to answer, but in your research of values, when values conflict, am I way off base that thinking the modern version of, we'll call it conservatism, not conservatives with a capital C, conservatism with a lowercase c versus progressivism with a lowercase p? Is there a way that people are addressing these value conflicts differently?
I would say that is what gets sensationalized in the media and on social media, is that kind of, I'm just going to cancel you. And then there is that kind of, you know, I think honestly, like, I mean, it comes back to, we don't have something above ourselves that we can look to anymore for everything else. So we have to bring it down on a ground level. So I don't think it's a coincidence that the more people have, and I'm a recently, you know, renewed Christian. I became a Christian last July. And so I basically was, you know, came on this past, I've only been a Christian for about, I would say, a year in my adult life. But I truly think there is, and I don't think you really have to be religious to understand this, is that when you don't have that thing that supersedes you and that that supersedes you, you're going to have a God value. And I think that has turned to most people to the most visible thing that they can feel control over, which is the political arena. And I think that has been, politics is now the religion of the 21st century. I think that's very, very clear, at least to me. And I think to a lot of people, as we're slowly starting to unravel what this thing is really going to be.
Right.
And I think that you're generally right in a lot of areas that, liberals are more of the freak out people and conservatives are more of like the, just kind of like, we'll just kind of do our own thing, let live and let live, all that other kind of stuff. But I think now, especially with, the rise of some of the things that we've seen, I would say, What Is a Woman, I think is a great example that is taking a very, very aggressive stance against basically the sacred cow of the liberal view of the world right now, which is, the transgender folks, the transgenderism movement, all that kind of stuff. Is, they're getting a lot more feisty. And if you watch, Fox News, especially, I think, I don't really care for, I would say, I like about maybe, and I am a conservative to answer that question. So I'm a pretty hard conservative too, but it doesn't mean, and most of my friends are liberals, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of an interesting, discussion I have there. And I have a lot of interesting discussions with my liberal friends, but that's beside the point. But anyway, I think there is kind of a stance on the conservative side. And I know a lot of conservative commentators and everything that are getting very, very hardcore, almost they're becoming what the left is now in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I remember writing a blog post about a year ago, or I don't know if it was a year ago, but about probably 8 or 9 months ago, called Liberals are the New Bigots and Conservatives are the New Snowflakes. And so I remember that the roles are basically all switching. And I think Glenn Greenwald, who I don't know if you know who that is.
Love him. I love his work. I support his Substack.
Yeah. So Glenn Greenwald has, I think, been on this from just so many levels. But he wrote a great piece on his Substack a couple of weeks ago that basically said, and Matt Taibbi also has written about this, I think, very, very well in a lot of ways, where Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald have taken the stance of, I would say the Democrat and liberal establishment. They're Bush Republicans. And I think the biggest key to this was that something that Glenn Greenwald pointed out a couple, I think it was in January, because it was the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th riot in the Capitol. And so he was talking about how, President Biden, Vice President Harris, they went up and they gave their speeches and they, said all the things that a lot of people said were controversial about the 9/11 comments, the Pearl Harbor comments. And so they invited a special guest to the White House that day to sit and watch the speech and, kind of do all the stuff with January 6th committee and everything. And that special guest, invited by the Democratic presidential establishment, was Dick Cheney, who they couldn't stand 20 years ago. And they said Dick Cheney, they made a movie, like literally 3 years ago. Adam McKay made a movie about how Dick Cheney was basically the devil and how he was like, and Dick Cheney, I don't think, I don't like Dick Cheney.
They openly called him Darth Vader on like MSNBC.
Yeah, right. And there are, and looking back on, I think, I wasn't even 10 at that point. I was kind of, very, very immature at that point. But I look back on the Bush and Cheney administration, and I think that they had a lot of merit to not like Dick Cheney. I mean, Dick Cheney did a lot of bad shit. And I think they did a lot of really, really bad shit with a lot of things that they did. And they were right to criticize him for a lot of that kind of stuff. But now it's almost done a complete 180 where they're inviting the guy who they hated and despised to the White House as a special guest on the anniversary of January 6th. It's gotten so bizarre. And so it's, I think it's more of not honestly a left and right issue, but it's almost, I think it's more of a class issue. It's kind of like a uniparty elite versus a non-elite, a have and have not type of a situation. And that's not even political. That's across business. That's across science. That's across a lot of people in establishments type of, across all, I would say, industries and metrics of people. And there are people who are kind of in this kind of neo-populist movement. And they're saying that, we don't necessarily like this. We want to be just left alone, treated as individuals, don't tread on our rights. Don't make us get vaxxed. Don't make us, do all this other kind of stuff, or, go out, like, don't take away my employment because I won't support this or whatever. Don't fire me because I don't support all this kind of stuff. But they're also kind of saying, like, don't go crazy, QAnon stuff on us and make us believe that, again, Hillary Clinton's raping children in the basement of a Pizza Hut in Washington, D.C. Like, don't make us believe that either. So it's it's an up and down issue, not a left and right issue, in my opinion.
You nailed something there, and I'm going to put some words in your mouth, so feel free to tell me that I'm totally wrong here. You mentioned how when there's nothing higher than us, right? And for a long time, maybe it was God. And then, at certain times in our history, maybe the thing that was higher than us was the patriotism and the idea of belonging to an America. Sure. The Marxist idea is like the highest is being a cog in the state, right? Like if that's what you aspire to. And if we think about like, if there's a religious size hole, I've heard somebody kind of coined this. If there's a religious size hole in the American populace and you have to fill it with something, it makes sense why things become so dogmatic, right? It makes sense why somebody's willing to shoot up a Pizza Hut because they believe, or the pizza store, whatever the hell it was, Parlor Pizza, because they believe in the basement, children are getting their stem cells sucked out of them for Hillary Clinton's, longevity. And then it also, if we think about like dogmatic practices, every time I see somebody riding by themselves in a car with a mask on, I'm like, that has nothing to do with science or virtue signaling. Yep. It's just a dogmatic belief that this magic piece of underwear is going to protect you, which is funny.
It's a religion.
Yeah, it's a religion, which is funny because I have to suspect if that same person wearing a mask by themselves in the car was asked what they thought about Jews wearing a yarmulke or Mormons wearing protective underwear, they would be like, that's crazy. They believe in like a sky fairy, and these magic pieces of cloth are going to protect them. And I'm like, well, what the fuck do you think is on your face? And same thing with the QAnon crazies. It's like, it's truly a religious belief where their highest value, getting back to your book, their highest value is now this dogmatic belief to the point where the person with the mask is willing to make this massive sacrifice thinking she's going to kill somebody. And the QAnon person is willing to make this massive sacrifice where they were willing to kill somebody because we've intertwined our values with this weird, like, dogmatic belief in politics. It just feels gross. And I also don't see a way back.
It's very hard to, a lot of the time. It's very, very hard to. And I think that it's going to take a massive societal, I'm very, very light to use the word revolution because, I mean, people, honestly, like the QAnon people take me seriously and then try to raid another Pizza Hut somewhere. But I think it'll be like, it's going to take, I would say, a value-based revolution about what we really think about is important in America. And I think are you a football fan by chance?
Yeah, and just for the YouTube fact checkers, we're not talking about a shooting gun revolution. We're talking about a cultural revolution.
A revolution of the spirit, as it were.
Yeah, there we go. Yes, I am a football fan, although the last 10 years, the Pittsburgh Steelers have been pretty shitty, so I haven't watched nearly as many games. And, it's interesting. I want to hear your anecdote. But getting back to values, like, if I watch sports, I value mindless entertainment. What I don't value is my athletes and the league that those athletes play in, virtue signaling and putting, hands up, don't shoot in the end zone. It's like, dude, I just want to watch a football game. If you guys, whatever, LeBron James, Ben Roethlisberger, like if any professional athlete wants to use their platform to talk about their politics on, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, go on the nightly news and like advocate for their cause, God bless you. But when I'm watching fucking football, I just want to watch football. I want to watch, running plays and passing plays and good tackling. And so once the NFL brought their social values, which I absolutely do not think that were their social values, I think it was just like basically it's pandering. It's absolute money pandering, but whatever. Yep. But once they started bringing political and social values into the game, other than like hanging out at my uncle's house and it's in the background, I don't think I've watched a football game other than maybe the Super Bowl in 4 years. So I was a massive football fan. Like through my 20s, college football, I would post up from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. at Barney's Brewery in Pasadena and watch nothing but football. But like now there's a conflict of values. And I'm not trying to cancel them. I'm not saying anybody's stupid for watching football. I just choose to not spend my money there because that's a conflict of values. Anyways, use your cultural revolution anecdote in football if you can.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think going back to your point earlier about, I thought you made an excellent point about the Boy Scouts. And I think that the reason why a lot of people got so upset about that, especially, I think, the big thing that started it was Kaepernick and all that kind of stuff that he did with kneeling for the national anthem. And it just got, progressively, I would say, more infused in the NFL game. And then obviously George Floyd, summer of 2020 happens, then it all kind of gets kicked up in the stratosphere. And a lot of people, got lost in the sauce and whatever. And I think the reason why people got so upset is a lot why you got upset, and you had that conflict with your friend about the scouts, because you think you had, like, that was a sacred place for you. That was my place to hang out with my guy friends and the men who mentored me. And I think there is something to be said for that. As far as everyone, I don't think that blending everything together in a blender and then throwing it all like, oh, we could have some of this here, some of this here, some of this here, whatever. In some places it's appropriate, but I don't think a lot of places that it is. I don't think it's appropriate in religion. I don't think it's appropriate in, I would say, we're talking in men's and women's, by the way, spaces. I think women are now starting to see some of this now with some of the things that are going on now. And I think their rights are under attack in a lot of ways, which is a very interesting thing to see. Now it's kind of getting moved to the other side of the aisle. But going back to the anecdote about, kind of cultural values and everything, and that, spiritual revolution we're going to have. So so I'm assuming, did you keep up with some of like the big headlines in the NFL last year, like you saw them on like the TV or something like that, or everything?
Yeah, I'm sure Sports Center or whatever.
Okay.
Although Sports Center is almost unwatchable now for the same reason. But anyway,
yeah. So John Gruden's resignation last year. Right. So John Gruden, for those who don't know, John Gruden is a legendary NFL coach. He won the 2002 Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of arguably, in my opinion, the most talented football teams to ever walk the face of the earth. And so he's a legendary coach. He was a Monday night, one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest Monday Night Football commentator ever. Went back to coach the former Oakland, now Las Vegas Raiders on a 10-year, $100 million contract. So he got loaded up to run the Raiders. And he was the former head coach of the Raiders, and he was really good back then. He got traded to the Buccaneers in the Super Bowl, all that kind of stuff. The rest is history. And so he goes and he gets basically unearthed a bunch of emails that he has with Bruce Allen, the now disgraced, Redskins executive. And so he gets leaked all these emails where he calls high NFL establishment guy, I forget what position he was, to Morris Smith. He insults his lips. He calls him, all these other things. He basically called called President Biden like a pussy or something. He went after Goodell pretty hard, like all that kind of stuff. And so he just kind of had all these quote unquote unfavorable emails come out, and they all had the same thread, kind of going to him like John. And then the world just exploded at this point. So John Gruden is a racist. John Gruden is a misogynist. John Gruden doesn't like gay people. He doesn't like all this other stuff. And which had never been said about John Gruden before up until that moment. Never. Not one time being accused of being any of these things. And now he was automatically labeled all of them. And so John Gruden resigned in disgrace. He, had to forfeit the rest of his money. He got scrubbed from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers Ring of Honor. They took his name down. Everything kind of did all that other kind of stuff. So he was simultaneously remembered and erased with ubiquity. Like he was just kind of just completely cleaned out of everything else. And so he was that was in the middle of the season. I think it was like week 7 that happened to John Gruden. So then one of his assistants steps in and becomes the head coach, and they win the next 2 games after John Gruden's resignation. And so, everything was like, oh, okay, maybe John Gruden was kind of a bad influence. Maybe they wanted to get rid of him, all this other kind of stuff. And then Henry Ruggs happens 3 weeks after that. So Henry Ruggs, I don't know if you follow this story at all. Henry Ruggs was a really, really talented wide receiver who played at the University of Alabama. They drafted him 12th overall 2 years prior to this happening. And Henry Ruggs was the number 1 receiver on the football team. He was very, very well liked. He was doing really good in the community. He had a charity. He had a really steady girlfriend. He had a child. He raised a ton of money, and he had never been in trouble his entire life. No drugs, no arrests, no anything like that. He was a model citizen by NFL standards, by people standards. And so Henry Ruggs decides to go out with his girlfriend one night and get drunk at a local place and come back and drive drunk home. And he's driving in his sports car and just kind of going home and whatever. And it's around, I think, 3:40 in the morning. And he's driving his car at 156 miles an hour and hits this 23-year-old woman named Tina Tintor, who's driving out to go to work or go to school or something. I think it was go to work. She was 23.
Drilled her, killed her, right?
Yeah. So he didn't just kill her. So he basically rammed his car into her car-on-car collision, 156 miles an hour. And so Henry Ruggs gets out basically unscathed, thank God. And so I think he has like some neck issues or whatever. His girlfriend had to get surgery on her arm. Her arm was pretty messed up. But so he didn't kill Tina Tintor and her golden retriever in the car. He trapped her in the car, and they burned to death. Both of them burned to death inside of the car. And so this was in the media for like a day. And everyone was basically saying, this is so awful. And it was a tragedy because Henry Ruggs' life is over. Henry Ruggs is going to go to prison for probably about 30 years. And he's going to lose all of his money. He's going to be isolated from his son. He's going to be isolated from his girlfriend, his family, his charity. His life is over, basically, at this point. So, but that was out of the news cycle in about a week.
Yep.
John Gruden was in the news cycle for months. So what kind of a society, no matter what John Gruden said in those emails, no matter what naked pictures he received from some entitled dumbass like Bruce Allen over email, no matter what John Gruden did, it is clearly, completely, and objectively better than killing somebody. No matter what Henry Ruggs' actions, Henry Ruggs didn't want to kill Tina Tintor. He didn't even know who the woman was. So Henry Ruggs is a good person. He just made a mistake and messed up. But the reality is, it is completely and unobjectively better to do all the things that John Gruden did than to kill somebody. And if we don't align our cultural values to where that is in the news and being discussed, if that's a discussion about reckless driving, about alcohol, about something constructive that we can, go into our society with, then John Gruden saying mean words to somebody over a private email thread, then that's a very, very significant problem. And if we don't fix that, and if we don't look at a case like that happened in the same team, in the same month, with everyone in both organizations present for it, with all the same people watching it on TV, then I don't really know what we do. So to your point about maybe it not being reversible, it might not be, but we have to look at situations like that where they're so close to the same sample size, the same group of people, that we need to really analyze that and see really, okay, what is at the center of our universe culturally? What is more important to us? Is it Henry Ruggs making a mistake, driving drunk, and killing a girl by burning her alive by accident, her dog, and her car? Or is it John Gruden saying mean words about DeMaurice Smith, who's a very, very high-paid and well-known NFL official in an email? Which one is it? And so if we can't have that conversation honestly, then I think I agree with you that it might not be reversible at that point.
I feel like we could talk for hours and hours and hours, and we might need to have you out to Vegas or LA to my house. We're kind of in between cities right now. Have you out to talk about this further. And I want to read your book, Chris, if you can order it on Amazon, The Value Economics. I want to read your book because we got introduced kind of like in a weird fashion, and I was just told I have to talk to you, which the person that introduced us, I respect. So I'm going to read the book and we're going to have you on, but I want to ask you one last question because I feel like you can get to know somebody in a really deep way this way. What's your favorite movie and why?
My favorite movie is The Godfather Part 2. I have a poster of it on the wall next to my television. My favorite movie is, I remember very few things that I can say like, oh, I did this, I watched this, it changed my life. My favorite, the first Godfather, when I watched it with my parents, changed my life. I'd never seen anything like it before in my entire life. And I know that's a cliche opinion to have about something, but it really was true. And The Godfather Part 2 is my favorite movie ever because I truly think it shows the tragedy of mankind. It truly shows how low human beings can sink if we allow ourselves to sink that low. And I think that I don't know if this makes me a dark person or whatever, but I think I love all the stuff that's very kind of gritty and raw and shows all the kind of, the negative aspects of human nature, especially because everything now seems to be so positive. And there is a lot of positive stuff going on right now, but I think we need to be reminded of the negative to show the positive. They're opposites. And I think I watch that movie and I get reminded kind of what I will sacrifice to get what I want, which is basically the lead character, Michael Corleone, played brilliantly by Al Pacino in the movie, doing everything he can to obtain absolute power and control over everything and what he has to sacrifice to get it. If you want, going back to the book, that is the value sacrifice trade-off in action right there.
Yeah.
That is diminishing returns of value. That is all these other things.
I love
and
it.
I think it is just the ultimate both ascendance and destruction of a human soul in one movie, which I find incredibly I've seen the movie probably 50 times. I find it incredibly fascinating. So that's why.
I love that movie. I'm going to have to rewatch it this weekend because it's been a few years. I appreciate having you on, Sam. As everybody who watches this podcast knows, I have an insanely small bladder, so I'm about to pee my pants. We got to have you out to Vegas for a long conversation. Chris is going to give you the rundown, man, but thanks for being on the show.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it, man.